Welcome back to the Miller Center. Sorry about the delay. We're excited to be kicking off the Miller Center's fall programming season today. We're sad that it's virtual. We had hoped to be back in person, but because of the Delta variant surge and the restrictions that we would face in having to do an event live, we're reverting back to the webinar format that we've used so well over the last year. And we're delighted with today's program as a way of kicking off the fall programming. It is a beautiful day here in Charlottesville. I know that in many parts of the country, particularly starting in New Orleans and extending across the Northeast now, people have gone through first hurricane and then Tropical Storm Ida. And so for those of you or friends and family who have been displaced, we sure hope that things will get better soon. But we're delighted at least to be able to host today's programming on the topic of friendship, something that we all need. Harry Truman once famously said, if you need a friend in Washington, get a dog. And then we recently learned at his funeral that Don Rumsfeld is reported to have added a corollary, get a small dog just in case it turns on you. To discuss presidents and their friends, we are joined today by Gary Ginsberg, who has worked in various capacities across media, politics, and law, and as a political and corporate advisor. And I'm delighted to say that Gary has been a friend of over 30 years, going back to the Dukakis campaign where we first met. Over the course of this extraordinary career, Gary has held positions at media and technology entities, including News Corp, Time Warner, and SoftBank, and in the Clinton administration, where he served in the White House counsel's office. He's a lawyer by training, having earned his JD at Columbia and his undergraduate degree at Brown. And he's spanned so many dimensions that touch on this topic. And for a first-time author, he has written an extraordinarily compelling and important book, as well as a fun one. First Friends pushes back on Aesop's dictum, a man is known by the company he keeps. In fact, the foundation of Gary's project is the fact that many of these best friends are not household names. The Oval Office serves as a unique fame vacuum. As our presidents go down in history, those around them are often all but forgotten. And so Gary has done a terrific job of setting the record straight and describing who some of these people have been and the impact that they've had. To lead the conversation with Gary is another longstanding friend of mine and of Gary's, who has undoubtedly helped us all understand American history in both ways that we know through his own books, but also in a behind the scenes way through his work, not just at the Miller Center and with the Miller Center, but through the History Channel. Steve Gillon is a professor of history at the University of Oklahoma, a non-resident faculty fellow at the Miller Center, and also a scholar in residence at the History Channel. So we're delighted to have both Gary and Steve joining us today virtually. Thanks for being friends of the Miller Center and for being friends of mine, and I'll turn it over to you to start the conversation.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for those kind words. Gary, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Steve.
So,
thank you, Bill. Thank you for those kind words.
It's such a clever book. Tell me, like, how did you come up with the idea as the first book? How did you come up with such a brilliant idea?
Well, I think I came up with it as a result of a series of experiences that I had really beginning, I think, in 1984, when I started working on Gary Hart's presidential campaign. And I witnessed this unique friendship between Gary Hart, who was a Democratic candidate for president, and Warren Beatty, the celebrated Hollywood actor. And Beatty would fly in for some of the most important events of the campaign, and he would speak to Hart in a way that nobody else on staff would. He would say, "Stop talking and acting like a politician, Gary." And Hart would be jarred, but he would listen to him in a way he wouldn't anybody else. And at the same time, they would go out and have late night dinners. That was Beatty's preferred time of day to do all kinds of business. And he would relax him in a way that nobody else on the campaign staff or even in his family could. And so I think I took note of it then, and then it was accentuated 8 years later when I worked for Bill Clinton on his campaign and then in his presidency. And I was able to witness his unique and first friendship with Vernon Jordan. And I saw the role that Vernon played, which was very similar to the role that Beatty played, both on a substantive level as well as on an emotional level. And at the same time, I write about in my preface, I had been sensitized to this issue during the vice presidential vetting process when I was interviewing Gore in this final interview with a man named Harry McPherson, who worked for Lyndon Johnson. And Harry had said to me before the interview, I don't care about his positions on the issues, that is Gore. I care about one thing, does he have friends? Because Harry had witnessed the loneliness that Johnson experienced and the lack of a first friend in the Johnson presidency, particularly during his deliberations over Vietnam. And he saw how debilitating and demoralizing that was, and how it helped to kind of lead to his ultimate decision not to run again in '68. So I think it was the accumulation of those experiences, coupled with the fact that in 2018, when I first came upon this idea, Donald Trump didn't have a first friend. And I saw the impact that I thought it had on his presidency. And so I came up with this idea. I looked at presidential literature to see what was written about it. And shockingly, there was nothing. There have been books about first wives, first sons, first pets, first decorators, first butlers, but there was nothing, fortunately for me, on the first friend. And I saw this niche and I decided it was time to fill it.
How do you discover who the first friend is? Is it always obvious who that first friend is?
No, it's not. There was one friendship was obvious to me, and that was the Jordan Clinton friendship. And he was the one president I could actually ask directly, who is your first friend? And Clinton, who is a legendary collector of friends, said, I need some time on this one. And he took about a month. And he came back to me and he said, okay, it's Vernon Jordan. And I was so grateful because I had already gone to Vernon and interviewed him in 2018 when I first came upon the idea. It was the first interview I had. Another president who had a lot of friends was John F. Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate to be able to go to his daughter, Caroline, whom I've known a long time, having gone to law school with her. And I said, who's your dad's first friend? And she gave me a name I never would have thought of. And it was one of the great pleasant surprises of this whole journey, a man named David Ormsby Gore, whom I write about. Other first friendships were kind of obvious to me. I grew up with Bibi Rebozo as this shadowy, dapper figure from my childhood. FDR, there were some obvious names. I didn't want to do the obvious, the Harry Hopkins or the Louis Howe. I really wanted to find somebody who provided a different dimension to his life. And I chose his distant cousin. Some were a complete surprise to me, like Nathaniel Hawthorne's friendship with Franklin Pierce, the only example where a friend is more famous today than the president. And some were total delights, like the friendship between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. I knew they had a close collaboration. They had worked together. I had no idea the depth of their friendship over 50 years. And that was just a pure delight to write about.
So who were the most influential friends in terms of policy?
There's a few. I think the most important friendship in terms of overall kind of policy for the life of our country would be Madison and Jefferson. I think in a particular moment, it would be Eddie Jacobson's friendship with Harry Truman, when he walks into the Oval Office uninvited, unannounced, and basically convinces him to recognize the state of Israel. It's a longer story, which I'm happy to go into, but there was a moment in time when a friend played a very pivotal role in a relationship between America and a key ally for the next 78 years.
Well, you dig down on that. That's a great story that you tell in the book. Go into some background on that.
Sure. Well, Harry Truman and Eddie Jacobson met in 1903 when Truman was a bank teller and Jacobson was a 16-year-old who had decided that education doesn't buy bread. So he went to work for a haberdashery and he would make deposits every day at Truman's bank, and they struck up a friendship. But then they drifted apart until 1917 when they meet again in the military. And they actually do a lot of work together. Jacobson was a great entrepreneur, came up with a way to modernize the canteen and turn it into a profitable enterprise. And Truman benefited greatly as a leader of that artillery unit. They decide after the war to go into business together. They run a haberdashery from 1920 to 1922. It fails, and they go their own ways again, but they have struck up a friendship by 1922 that is enduring. Truman obviously goes on to become a senator and then vice president and then president. Jacobson stays as a haberdasher. He's a very simple man, but he and Truman just had a really kind of common man bond that worked for them. And they spent all their time together when Truman was in Kansas City. Eddie would go to Washington to see him. But the relationship takes on a completely different complexion in March of 1948. Truman has to make a very important decision. What do you do about the land in Palestine? The UN in November of 47 had decided to partition it. But there were members of Truman's administration, most notably George Marshall, the most revered, powerful member of his cabinet, who did not want an independent state for the Jewish people, and was telling Truman that when the mandate ran out in May of 48, that he should punt on the issue, not recognize a state, leave it to the UN, which would essentially have meant leaving it to no decision at all, to leave it under a trusteeship. And Truman had I think, an inclination to want to support an independent state of Israel, but Marshall's opposition, plus the hectoring of Jewish lobbyists, had really driven Truman to a point where he did not want to deal with the issue anymore. He said, Jesus Christ couldn't please the Jews when he was alive. How am I supposed to do it today? And so by March of 48, he's just decided, I'm not going to do any more on this issue. And at the same moment, Chaim Weizmann, a British scientist and probably the world's leading Zionist at that point, is sitting in New York waiting to come down to Washington to see Harry Truman. He's the one person who can convince Truman to recognize the state. And Truman won't see him. So Eddie Jacobson gets on a plane, flies halfway around the country, walks up the north driveway of the White House, walks into the appointment secretary office, Matt Connolly, and says, I need to talk to Truman. And Matt Connolly knew of their great friendship. So he said, absolutely, but one thing, don't talk about Palestine. So Eddie says, of course I won't, walks into the White House. They start making chit chat. Finally, Truman says, Eddie, what are you doing here? You've never come to ask for anything. What are you doing here? And Jacobson says, you have to see Chaim Weizmann. And Truman at that point gets his back up and goes into a rant. He talks about how he'd been disrespected by the Jewish people and didn't want anything more to do with the issue. And at that point, Eddie said, I, for the first time, thought he was an anti-Semite. So he's standing in front of Truman. He knows the fate of a Jewish state is hanging in the balance. And he looks over and he sees a bust of Andrew Jackson. And he knows that Andrew Jackson is Harry Truman's idol. And he says, what would Andrew Jackson do? Would Andrew Jackson be cowed by a bunch of, quote, sissies, is what he says? I don't think so. He would do what he knows to be right. And you know the right thing to do now is to see Chaim Weizmann and recognize a Jewish state. So Truman turns red in his face, turns his back to Truman, swivels around, looks out the back window toward the garden, bangs his hand on the desk, turns back around and says, God damn it, you son of a bee, I'll see him. And at that moment, Eddie Jacobson said he was the happiest man on earth. He realized that he had broken this logjam. A few days later, Harry Truman saw Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann sealed the deal. And then 11 minutes after the state of Israel was declared in Tel Aviv in May of 1948, Harry Truman was the first foreign leader to recognize an independent Jewish state.
That's a great story. The other one that I was struck by was, there are a couple of them that are fascinating in terms of their impact on policy itself. And I want to talk about other ways that they influence the presidency, but Colonel House is another one that comes obviously to mind. Tell me about Colonel House and his relationship with Woodrow Wilson and the lead up to World War I.
Yeah, well, it's an unheard of type of friendship in terms of influencing policy today. It would never happen. Colonel House was the most powerful private citizen / friend of a president in our country's history. He was a very wealthy Texas businessman who had always wanted to operate on a national and, in fact, an international stage. And in 1911, he's looking for, quote, the man and the opportunity. At the exact same moment, Woodrow Wilson, who is the governor of New Jersey, is looking to run for president. And he knows he needs a best friend. He had a best friend on the Princeton faculty who he had a very bitter break with in 1907. And he was friendless. And his daughter later said that his two tragedies in life were the loss of his friendship with this professor in Princeton and the loss of the League of Nations in terms of passing that treaty. So there's just this moment in time when these two people come together, the man and the opportunity, and they forge a friendship starting in November of 1911. By January of 1913, when Woodrow Wilson is president-elect, he's the most powerful man in Woodrow Wilson's orbit. He's essentially picking his cabinet for him. And he becomes an indispensable emotional crutch for Wilson, as well as a personnel advisor and policy advisor on certain matters. The relationship develops, and Wilson decides, he doesn't really want to deal in foreign policy. He's picked a Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who's really ill-fitted for the job. And at that moment, House sees an opportunity. I can actually deal not just on a national level, but on an international level. So he pretends that he needs to go over to Europe. He goes over to Europe. He gets the imprimatur of Wilson to meet with the British Foreign Secretary, the German Kaiser. He starts to meet with leaders, and sure enough, he becomes the de facto Secretary of State by the end of 1913. And then for the next 6 years, he is his diplomat in chief, his de facto Secretary of State, and the most important, kibitzer and advisor internally to Woodrow Wilson. It all plays out over, a very large canvas of international capitals in Washington, D.C., until its tragic ending in 1919, when he's basically, they negotiate the treaty in Paris, the Versailles Treaty, and at the train platform, as Wilson is bidding goodbye to Paris after signing the treaty that afternoon, he says goodbye to Edward House, never speaks to him again. His wife had essentially exacted a revenge that I think started the moment his second wife exacted a revenge. She had become his second wife in 1915, saw the role that House had played on her husband, and I think she basically didn't want somebody else playing the central role in her new husband's life. And for 4 years, she tried to undermine him. She was able to extract the final massacre of him in Paris just before the end of that treaty process. And for the next 20 years of House's life, he tried to make sense of this great undoing. It was the tragedy of his life. And I think he never quite could reconcile how he could have gone from such a central role to be cast as such an outsider that he wasn't even invited to Wilson's funeral.
Wow, that's incredible. Gary, we have a question from a student at the University of Virginia, and she asks, can you expand on the friendship between Thomas Jefferson and Madison, the role Madison played in Thomas Jefferson's presidency? And she says, it's very interesting to us UVA students.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And I'm sure a lot of you know a heck of a lot more than I do about Thomas Jefferson being at the university. I don't think it's just the influence that Madison had on Jefferson, but I also think that influence that Jefferson had on Madison, it was a great collaboration, but it was also a great friendship. And I think, just to expand on your question, it wasn't just during his presidency that you see this played out. It's really played out from their first meeting in 1776 until Jefferson's death in 1826. It's a 50-year friendship that encompasses 1,250 letters that were exchanged between the two men. But I think, Madison, they were so different, both in body and in personality and in temperament. Jefferson was 6'2", 6'3". Madison was 5'4". Jefferson was a larger than life personality. Madison was very shy and timid, but yet they worked together beautifully. I think Madison needed Jefferson's large personality and his idealism, and Jefferson needed Madison's exacting mind and his practical nature. And I think you see it played out in things as small as how they approached the Alien and Sedition Act, or how they approached how he was going to deal with John Adams when Jefferson comes in as his vice president in 1797. And Jefferson wants to just become friends with Adams, and Madison's so calculating. He's so exacting. He says, don't commit yourself to it yet. We don't know where this is going to go. But also, they were such great personal friends that they saved each other at seminal moments and played pivotal roles in keeping each on this trajectory to their greatness. For example, when Jefferson is basically run out of the governorship in 1781, and then undergoes a trial of sorts to see whether he abdicated his responsibility. He's ultimately vindicated, but he's demoralized, and also his first wife dies, and he wants to just get out of politics. He's done. He just wants to stay on, at Monticello and just live an agrarian life and a life of the mind. But Madison says, no, you can't give up your public life. You're too important to this new nation. And he is the one who goes to the Confederate Congress and says, you got to get him back in the game. And he really gets him to Paris by 1783. And that kind of a dynamic plays out throughout. For example, when they live together in Philadelphia during, while Madison is in the Confederate Congress and Jefferson is waiting to first go over to Paris, Jefferson notices that Madison has fallen for a 15-year-old. He's 32 years old at the time. He was unmarried. And this 15-year-old jilts him, just devastates him. But there is Jefferson to provide the emotional support for a man who, for the first time in his life, had fallen in love and didn't know how to deal with the rejection. So it plays out throughout their life. And as I say, I think it's in many ways responsible indirectly or directly for things like our Constitution, for our Bill of Rights, for our two-party system, for the geographic construction of our country through the Louisiana Purchase. And then obviously, the whole state university system that Jefferson, with Madison's help, and Madison was a very big part. And I certainly don't want to talk to that. There's people here who are far more knowledgeable about the development of this university system. But really from UVA, I think it's fair to say that a state university system was born. So it was for me a lot of fun to discover just the depth of this friendship.
Yeah, I can see that. And I have to tell you that one of the ones that we've talked about this before, the one that really surprised me was JFK. I would have thought Dave Powers or Kenny O'Brien or Kenny O'Donnell or one of these people. So tell me more. Caroline takes you off on a completely different tangent that I had never thought of. So tell me about that and tell me what role he plays in JFK's life. How does he get involved in JFK's life?
Yeah, well, I had first gone to Caroline with the obvious choice of Lem Billings, because everybody says Lem Billings was his best friend. But Caroline, I think very smartly said, no, there's somebody else who has been lost to history, but I know from my own dealings with him, and she got to know him quite well in London toward the end of his life, and through her mother, that this was a person who played a really consequential role in the president's intellectual life, as well as he and Jackie's personal life. They met in 1938, pre-war London. They were both second sons of powerful fathers. Both didn't really know what to do in their lives. They were well educated, but somewhat aimless. They loved to talk fast. They loved to gossip. They loved to go drinking, carousing, go to the horse races. And they forged this bond in pre-war London that really kind of takes its shape in that pivotal period where they debate the nature of leadership in a democracy. Does a leader like Churchill owe it to the body politic to do what's right, regardless of where the electorate is? Or is the leader should the leader be more in the guise of a Chamberlain or a Baldwin and wait for the electorate to come to what you believe, but you think needs the public to get there before you can take them where you want to? So they debate that issue for many, many years. They each rise in their respective bureaucracies. Kennedy becomes a senator. Ormsby Gore becomes a member of the House of Commons, becomes a member of the Ministry of State, becomes the chief negotiator for the British with the Russians in the 50s, becomes an expert in nuclear disarmament. All this leads to 1960 when Kennedy decides to run for president. They are great friends by now. They've spent weekends at Hyannis. Jackie has fallen in love with Ormsby Gore's brain. But in 60, Kennedy makes a disquieting discovery. He decides none of my foreign policy advisors really are in sync with me. There's only one guy who is in sync with me, and it's Gore. So he brings him into kind of his informal cabinet. And Ormsby Gore provides crucial foreign policy advice on how to navigate this issue of a missile gap, which was a kind of faux issue, at the same time promoting this kind of détente by talking about nuclear disarmament. And he just kind of hits this sweet spot with Kennedy. So now Kennedy becomes president, Ormsby Gore becomes the British ambassador. The relationship plays out most dramatically during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy decides on day 5 that he needs the counsel of David Ormsby Gore more than anybody. And he makes a command that when he gets back to Washington on day 6, he wants to see Gore. He's deciding between blockading or bombing Cuba. And he and Ormsby Gore launched right back into that familiar kind of repartee that started in 1938 about what is a leader to do. And Ormsby Gore counsels very strongly for a blockade. Kennedy comes around to it. He's back at the White House that night, spends hours and hours with Kennedy, both in the private residence and then in ex-com meetings. He's with him the night after he makes his address to the nation announcing the blockade, and he's looking at the blockade, he's looking at the perimeter. He sees it's 800 miles. Ormsby Gore says to Kennedy, it should be 500 miles. You're not giving the Russian ships enough time to think about what the consequences are of breaking a blockade. Kennedy calls up McNamara and says, I want the perimeter moved. It was that kind of advice that played out over the entirety of the Cuban Missile Crisis that Kennedy grew so reliant on. And then it plays itself out most dramatically in the final months of his administration, when Ormsby Gore almost single-handedly, I believe, is responsible for Kennedy pushing and evangelizing for the limited nuclear test ban treaty that's passed in August of 1963. It's his last significant piece of legislation. And Steve, you and I have talked about its significance. You know, in many ways, it's really the first really important pact between the two nations that begins the process that leads ultimately to the end of the Cold War. And at the same time, just real quickly, he and his wife, Sissy, were such good friends. They spent inordinate amounts of time on weekends at Glen Ora, Hyannis, at Camp David. They were going to name their third son, their third child, Patrick. The godmother was going to be Sissy, David Ormsby Gore's wife. But this is a story that's really been lost to history because Ormsby Gore didn't really talk about it other than to give one oral interview to the Kennedy Library. And he was a very, very self-effacing, quiet man. I mean, quiet in the sense that he didn't seek the limelight. So his name's been lost, but I'm so grateful to Caroline for giving me that lead, because I think in many ways he was the most important emotional ballast for Kennedy, as well as his most important intellectual kind of compatriot in those final years.
After the assassination, does he have an affair with Jackie?
Well, that's a good
question. Not a normal role for a first friend?
Well, it's an interesting, yes, and I was going to get to that. In 1967, when we only learned this in 2017, when papers of Ormsby Gore's were discovered at his estate, he died in 1985, and his family, for some reason, opens up a trunk and they find all these letters between Gore and Jackie. And it turns out that Ormsby Gore had proposed to Jackie in June of 1967, shortly after his wife Sissy had died in a car accident. And Jackie writes back to him and says, you and I share too much pain together. And if either of us are going to find a world of peace and happiness, we need to do it apart from each other. And she writes him a beautiful letter that has now been auctioned off and is now part of the historical record. Whether they had an affair, Caroline, I think, is unsure of it herself. I asked her. I think she says a lot of men like to claim they had affairs with her mother. I don't know. I would suspect they probably did, but I'm really not in a position to state unequivocally that they did.
So these people we've been talking about, whether it be Gore or Colonel House or Eddie Jacobson, are all first friends who played a very specific role in which they had an impact on policy. What other roles do first friends play in the life of presidents?
So that leads to what I said about FDR. I chose a first friend who did not play a consequential role, did not advise on hard policy decisions, didn't speak the blunt truth, didn't march into the Oval Office and make demands, but somebody who gave FDR what he desperately needed in the White House, and that was company. That was constant company. FDR, despite fighting a world war and a depression, was an intensely lonely president. His son subtitles his book, A Lonely Man, A Lonely President. And partly because his wife was often away from the White House crusading for important causes. His children, were not really present in the White House until his daughter Anne came in 1944. So he says to Daisy Suckley one day, I'm either exhibit A or left entirely alone. And he was a man who did not like to be left entirely alone. He liked the company. He particularly liked the company of women. He was always more comfortable with women than he was with men. And Daisy fit the bill. She started giving him this kind of comfort in 1922 when he's recovering from polio. And she sits on the verdant lawns of Springwood while he lifts his body up in this chair to try to rebuild his upper body. And then she plays that role just to perfection, and particularly in the last 4 to 5 years of FDR's life. She's with him pretty much every third day, from what I could tell. They exchange a lot of letters when he's traveling. He's always writing her letters. They're exchanging presents. She is an archivist at his library. He starts the first presidential library, in fact, in 1941. And she is an archivist so that he can spend even more time without it ever raising eyebrows. And I raise that because I do think that there was a physical dimension to their friendship at one point on one day in September of 1935. And I think that they were both deeply attracted to each other physically, but also deeply attracted to each other emotionally. So it was that powerful combination that kept that relationship so charged and so deep. And I think that, as I say, she was the primary antidote to his loneliness. And you can't discount the importance of that. And that, to me, is the importance of a friend, because a friend doesn't have to always speak the blunt truth, to be the truth teller, or to be the kind of person in your face to say, no, you're doing something wrong. You also want friends in your life who are supportive, who are with you in good times and in bad, who share your values, share your interests, and can be a sympathetic ear and even a quiet presence when you need it, because you don't want to be alone. And that too is the relationship of B.B. Rebozo and Richard Nixon. So I have 2 stories really of the 9 where I think the model is entirely different than the ones that I've just described.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a favorite? Do you have a one person, the one first friend who was not necessarily the most influential, but the one who you think best played the role of first friend?
Yeah, that's a really, it's kind of like asking me, which of my 2 boys is my favorite son.
Sam.
I think Alec is listening, so don't say that. It's funny. One of the joys of this book was living with some of these heroes of my past for weeks on end, months on end. I just loved it. I think Gore was a real joy because I had no idea who he was. When Caroline said to me, David Ormsby Gore, I had to say, I think I know him. Who is he exactly? And then to kind of bring him to life, and then to talk to his daughter, whom I found in London. And, I think the family now is taking so much joy from the fact that finally, after all these years, their father is getting his due as kind of this, playing this important role in Kennedy's life. In terms of, I guess, a favorite, maybe it's Joshua Speed and Lincoln, just because of the road they traveled and how you could get these 2 very different people who have this intimate friendship for 4 years where they literally sleep in a bed together, a double bed for 4 years. And then they go completely apart, really for 12 years, where one is a slave owner and one is becoming, the great emancipator. It's a long process. But Joshua Speed was a Democrat who just decided he wanted to be a businessman and make as much money as he could, and he did it using slaves. Lincoln decides he wants to be a lawyer and a public servant. And by the time 1854, 1855 comes along, he's really developed, a very strong view, anti-slavery view that ultimately results in obviously the Emancipation Proclamation. But yet they come back together again after this foundation of living together for 4 years in Springfield, such that they can debate the institution of slavery letters that I write about in the mid-1850s. And then when Lincoln becomes president, one of the first meetings he has is with Joshua Speed. He says, can you come to Chicago and see me? So they meet in a hotel. They hadn't seen each other, mind you, hadn't seen each other really in about 15 years. And the first thing that Lincoln says to Speed is, will you join my administration? It's very similar to Doris Kearns' idea of a team of rivals. He knows that Speed probably hasn't voted for him. He knows that Speed is, a slave owner who believes in the institution of slavery because he says it's provided for by the Constitution. And he thinks that if you break up slavery, you're going to break up the Union. And he ultimately wants to preserve the Union. But Speed, to his credit, says, I'm not going to join your administration because I'm too rich and I don't want to give up my money, but I'm going to do everything I can to help you win this war. And Speed came from Kentucky. Kentucky was a border state. Lincoln knew that he couldn't lose Kentucky. That was the linchpin of the border states. So Speed goes back to Kentucky and does everything he can to help Lincoln. He helps him message the war so that Kentuckians don't think it's just being fought over for slavery, but for the purposes that they deem legitimate. He makes sure that arms get to Union militianists in Kentucky. And he goes up to the White House for the first Thanksgiving and provides emotional support to Lincoln. And the friendship just flourishes during those 4 years. And I think Speed plays this crucial role in keeping Kentucky in the Union, probably the most pivotal role. And I think you can't underestimate, the importance of that friendship that was forged in the 1840s, in the late 1830s, that helps Lincoln 24 years later to win this war. And it just, to me, shows the importance of friends that you make early in life that you sustain either hot or cold, but you keep, and how it can play out over a long life.
I want to go back to the comment that Harry McPherson made to you about Al Gore.
Sure.
Based on the research that you've done and these terrific stories that you tell of individual presidents and their best friends, do you think that a successful president, in order to be successful, a president needs to have a best friend?
No, and I don't think history shows that. I would have loved to have come to that conclusion. I think, Al Gore and George Bush is an interesting example. George W. Bush had many, many great friends. And in fact, I talked to his chief of staff who talked to him. He wanted to cooperate for this book. He wanted to talk about his great friendship with Don Evans, for example. But can you say that did Don Evans help save George Bush's president? To the extent that it's a failure, you can't say he did. You can't say that because he had a best friend, he was going to succeed as president. I think what I have learned, and I think to the extent that there is a thesis to the book, it's that those presidents who did have a best friend were generally better for it, and so was our country. And that's what I discovered in the telling of these 9 stories. Now, you could argue that Bibi Rebozo played a really important role in Richard Nixon's life, and I think he was for the most part a positive influence. But in those last 4 years, when he could have spoken truth to him in the way he did in 1967, when he told Dick Nixon, "Do not run for president. I saw what you did in 60 and 62 with your family after you lost. It was quite ugly, and nobody had a better seat to see the emotional toll that it exacted on Pat, Tricia, and Julie than Bibi Rebozo. And he didn't want to see Nixon or the family go through that again if he lost in 68. So he says, don't run. And Nixon doesn't listen to him, he runs. But when Nixon becomes president, he gets immediately insecure, as we all know. And I don't need to retrace, all the dirty tricks that were played. But Bibi Rebozo, instead of saying to Dick Nixon, listen, Dick, I'm going to appeal to you need to appeal to your better angels. You're a better man than this. You don't need to do these nefarious acts to stay in power. You are a powerful president with a lot of tools that are legal. You don't need to raise campaign funds off the books. You don't need to destabilize the Graham family and try to destroy their IPO because you're angry at the Washington Post. Instead, he's an enabler. And he takes this $100,000 loan from Howard Hughes in 1970 that rears its ugly head later on. And I think it's really the cause, I believe, of why Nixon decided he needed to bug Larry O'Brien at the DNC, and which obviously led to his impeachment and then his ultimate resignation. And I think that Bibi Rebozo, could have played a very, very different role in that presidency, and unfortunately didn't.
You talk about enablers. Some people have accused Vernon Jordan of being an enabler for Bill Clinton and his various affairs, but you came to a different conclusion.
Yeah, I don't think let's just go. We'll just go right to the issue. Did he commit perjury by testifying that he didn't know about the affair, and that in getting a job for Monica Lewinsky before she was subpoenaed, and then during, before the scandal broke, he had been asked to get her a job in New York, which he did. And that became a prime area of inquiry for the prosecutors. And the question was, did Vernon Jordan try to help Bill Clinton wiggle out of this impeachment saga? The answer, I think, is no, and I'll tell you why. I talked to Bill Clinton quite directly about this after, unfortunately, the book was published, because I asked him, I already had confirmed that Vernon had gone to Hillary Clinton, and it's in my book, and had convinced her not to leave Bill after he had admitted to the affair to Hillary and then to the nation in August of 1998. And I said, was that true? And he said, absolutely true. He said, that's the only person I could trust to have that conversation with Hillary. And for Hillary, he was the only person that she respected enough to have that conversation. And I said to him, but let me ask you something. Did he know about the relationship that you had with Monica Lewinsky, such that, he was getting her a job to get her out of town? And what he said to me was interesting. He said, I never talked to Vernon or to any of my closest friends about my relationships with women for two reasons. One was I was ashamed. And the second was that I didn't want to implicate them. So I was very, very careful to never talk about those kinds of matters with Vernon or any of my other closest friends, which were probably two or three other people I could think of. So I don't think that Vernon intentionally obstructed justice. I don't think he was an enabler of Bill Clinton. I think he was actually in many ways a very, very positive influence for Clinton, both before he became president and then during his presidency. I think he gave him very good advice on personnel. I think he could see when people weren't serving Clinton personally or the presidency well, but themselves, and would quickly point that out to Clinton. He would move chiefs of staff, move cabinet secretaries out of their jobs, move people in that he had. One thing about Vernon was he had great EQ. And he also had the best intelligence of anybody in Washington. So when Clinton had a really thorny kind of political decision to make, Vernon was really the person that he relied on because his antennae stretched far and wide in Washington. And I think also on a personal level, he was the person he most wanted to relax with on the golf course, for meals. And I think that Clinton really suffered the last 2 years of his presidency because of the damage that he thought he had brought upon Vernon in thrusting him into that national spotlight. And I think the final meal that they have together in the White House in early of 2001 that I write about toward the end of the book was Clinton's chance to say, I'm sorry. I didn't intentionally mean to put you in harm's way. And I think that over that 6-hour period that I write about extensively, they kind of like finally come to that understanding. And a lot of grievance was let go that night. And then for the next 20 years, they enjoyed a beautiful friendship. And unfortunately, Vernon dies in March of this year. And Clinton gave, the final and most moving eulogy at that service.
Gary, we're running short on time, and there are some members of the audience who've been very patient and who have
I'm
questions
sorry.
for you.
Please.
And these are a lot tougher than my questions.
So,
one person wants to know about the relationship between Franklin Pierce and Nathaniel Hawthorne. And they write, they were very close friends from their college days, but did Hawthorne influence Pierce's policies during his presidency?
He didn't. In fact, Hawthorne spends the entirety of Pierce's presidency in Liverpool as the counsel. And the reason why he gets this job is because he writes the, quote, biography. In the 1850s and 1840s, the way you sold a candidacy was not through the slick television ad that we've all come to get used to, but through a biography. And Pierce had to figure out who's going to write his biography. And who better for Pierce than the country's most celebrated author at that point, who was Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom he had been friends with since 1821, when they were both students at Bowdoin, and stayed very, very close friends from 1821 to now we're talking about 1852. So Hawthorne writes his first nonfiction book. Many people believe it was just another book of fiction because he glorifies this very flawed figure, but helps elect him president. And his reward for helping get him elected is to be given the second most important diplomatic post at the time, which was consul to Liverpool. because you got a little piece of the action for every piece of trade that went through the port of Liverpool. The council would get some, small percentage. So Hawthorne is living this kind of tedious but remunerative life where he can continue to write his books and prance around Europe. The only thing he does is he stays an unabashed supporter of Pierce's, while Pierce is essentially burning down the house. He's allowing the country to devolve into civil war by supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. He's the first sitting president to not get the nomination of his party for a second term. His presidency is that flawed. It leads to James Buchanan's election, perhaps the worst president in our country's history. Pierce is probably the second or third worst. And the two of them end up being they're doughboys. They're Northerners who support slavery. And they both get alienated from their communities, but they maintain this really deep friendship after Pierce leaves the White House. It's two men against the world, essentially. And Hawthorne dies in Pierce's hands. Pierce basically ends up drinking himself to death. It's really the saddest story of friendship in my book, but a really enduring and in many ways beautiful friendship between two very flawed men.
So I'm going back to some of the questions that the audience has, and if anyone in the audience has questions, please feel free to post them. This is an interesting one. Have any of the first friends been called to testify before a congressional committee to be questioned about the substance of any of the friends' conversations with the president?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Okay, so yes, well, let me broaden it. Jordan was called for 20 hours of grand jury testimony about his relationship with the president vis-a-vis the Monica Lewinsky relationship. Also, I'm going to, Bibi Rebozo was called before the Senate Select Committee on Investigations because of $100,000, I mentioned this earlier, $100,000 loan/bribe that he had received. And the Senate committee was very suspicious. He testified a couple of times. He was then basically caught red-handed lying. He was subpoenaed for another appearance. He never responded to the subpoena. He was ultimately charged civilly with not declaring the income, paid a fine to the IRS, but was never charged criminally. Other than the two of them, nobody else, to my mind, certainly of the other seven, nobody else was called to testify.
And part of that is because most best friends don't become part of the administration, right? Most of them.
No, in fact, I made it part of the way I kind of thought about it in my own minds. I didn't want a staff person nor anybody from a family, because I think staff and family are just different types of relationships with the president than a friend. Because, you could write about chiefs of staff as being the first. I mean, in the case of Jim Baker, it would have been hard to do George H.W. Bush because he was both his best friend and his chief of staff, and which is probably why I didn't do that story. But in my case, no, these were friendships, not people who worked in an administration.
Gary, we have about 5 minutes left. So another member of the audience asks, who do you think is President Joe Biden's best friend?
Well, if you ask 100 people very close to the Biden orbit, they will all tell you it's Ted Kaufman. Ted Kaufman was his chief of staff for 22 years. Not only did he work with Joe Biden, but he would also take the Amtrak back and forth to Wilmington, where Ted also lived. They forged such a close friendship that in 2015, when Bo was dying and Ted was living in Wilmington, then Vice President Biden calls up Ted and says, I need you in Washington. I don't want to see Bo die and then deal with its aftermath alone. Would you come to Washington for a 120-day special governmental employee unpaid designation and be with me? And he did. And he sat there for 120 days in a little office in the EOB. And whenever Biden needed him, just for a comforting word, for a meal, for a walk, he was there. And today he sits in Wilmington and is always available when Biden calls. I think Biden calls a lot. He was the first non-family member to sleep in the White House. He's a lovely man. I've gotten to know him very well just on the phone. And and I wish I could write about him. I really do, as I think their friendship is extraordinary, both on a policy level. If you read Richard Ben Kramer's book, What It Takes, you'll see the role that Ted Kaufman plays in the 1988 presidential campaign. When Biden is deciding, do I get out in the throes of the Kimmett scandal, the last person he wants to talk to is Ted Kaufman. Ted,
I want to get one more question in before we're out of time. And this comes from a member of the Miller Center staff who has your next book for you.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
So the question is, has a president ever had a best enemy? Meaning someone who was opposed to them, but who actually helped them. As in, you are known as much by your friends as you are by your enemies.
Yes, First Enemies. A couple of people have suggested the book First Enemies. I mean, it's funny because, living in the through the Clinton administration, he had so many enemies, right? Richard Scafe, right? Who just would spend every dollar he had in his fortune to destroy Bill Clinton. Did Richard Scafe end up helping Bill Clinton in the end? No, I'm afraid not. It's a really, really interesting question. And I think it's worthy of some real inquiry because I think it would make for a great book. And listen, if you want to work with me on it, whoever you are, please, through Bill, reach out to me.
I'll put you in touch.
Yeah, put me in touch. Exactly.
So Gary, the person who asked that question, by the way, is someone you and I both know.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that. This is book number 1. And hopefully there's going to be many more. What's the next one?
First Enemies. I don't know. I mean, I've been toying with a lot of different ideas. I think I do want to write another book because I just love the process. Steve, I've watched you write books for years and years. I didn't know if I had it in me because I've been such an externally facing person all my life, and I didn't know if I'd have the discipline to sit by myself in solitude. But I found the beauty in it. I have to say, now maybe it's because the world had come to a screeching halt during the majority of the time I was writing. But I just loved living in the world of ideas and personalities that I just got transfixed by, and then being able to convert it into words that fortunately have resonated was a really great joy. One of the great joys of my professional life, for sure. So yeah, I'd love to find another topic that I can have that same experience with.
Well, I think there's, I think we could probably use a volume 2 of the Mondale biography, update it post 1984.
I was thinking the ADA, Steve.
ADA. Well, listen, you're great at it. And this is a remarkable first book. And I look forward to reading future books, although not reading them as often as I did this book.
Well, and Steve, I just want to thank you for your great input on this book. I sent a lot of chapters to Steve for his very smart, brilliant eye and pen, and he was invaluable. And I want to thank Bill and the Miller Center for allowing me to talk about my book with such a great friend as Steve. And so thank you to everybody. And thanks to all of you for listening today. I really appreciate it.
This has been great, Gary. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.